Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to bezel set a stone. We'll talk about what kind of stones we use to do a bezel set with and the materials that we need in just a moment. But first, safety. You are going to be soldering in this step, so you need to follow all of our regular safety precautions for soldering. So hair is tied back, goggles are on, no loose drapey clothing or things that could fall down into the flames. Make sure you're careful when you're using your torch. Take your time. Bezel setting requires quite a bit of precision. The type of stone that we use to make a bezel set piece is called a cabochon. Cabochon. So if you're looking to purchase stones for this, you want to look up cabochons, or what I call them, cabs. A cabochon is a stone like this. It's flat on the back and it has a slightly domed top. We do not use a bezel set to set faceted stones. There's different setting processes that we use for that. So we're going to be using a cabochon in this process. The first step in making a bezel is cutting and then fitting and soldering your bezel wire. Bezel wire is just a thin, flat piece of wire. I have silver and then I also have copper wire, which is what we use in class. You need your stone, 2 pliers, a wire cutter, get a good one, a flat file, and 300 sandpaper. Your first step is measuring and cutting the wire. So whenever I get out a piece of wire, I look at the end and I double check that it's straight. If it's not cut straight, I'll straighten out the cut. This one looks a little bit crooked, so I'm gonna straighten that out. I want it to be a perfect 90 to the rest of the piece. All right, that's step 1. Step 2 is I'm gonna take that wire, I'm gonna put one side of it on the flat edge of my stone, and I'm gonna curl the other around. And what I'm trying to do here is just ascertain how long of a wire I should cut. So you can see here where they overlap. I wanna cut just slightly longer than that overlap. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my little wire cutters and I'm just gonna make a little tiny dent right where they overlap. So I'm not cutting, I'm just indicating that that is where I should cut. And you can see here, there's a little bit, basically it's like a scratch. I'm gonna straighten my wire out and then I wanna cut straight down at a 90 at that location. All right, I'm gonna repeat that with the copper wire on my smaller stone here. With a small stone like this, it's a little harder to bend the wire around. So I'm gonna use a pair of pliers and I'm just gonna kind of curl my end a little bit. Now you don't wanna have big gaps like this. You don't wanna cut a bezel humongous. You want it to fit. You don't want it too big, you don't want it small, you want it like Baby Bear, just right. So I can see where my overlap is right here. Make sure that cut is nice and straight. The next thing you're gonna do is straighten out your wire. So just use a pair of flat pliers, straighten out that wire. And you are gonna come in and you're gonna file these ends. So right now, when we cut these with a wire cutter, I don't know if my camera will get close enough, it kind of pinches the end. You see how the end comes to a point? We want that to come to a flat edge. So if this was the bezel wire, we want it flat like the end of this piece of wood. And right now it's pinched, it comes to a point. So we need to file off that pinched end so we've got a flat end. And this is a tricky part, and it's a spot a lot of my students struggle with to get right. You're gonna put your wire on the bench hook, square to the edge hanging over. You're gonna hold your file like we normally do at a forward angle, and you are just going to come in very gently, flip it and do the same. When I look at the end now, I can see that it's flat. You see how it catches the light there? It's flat. If I look in this direction, there's no pinch to it. And the other thing I want to look for is that this edge is square to this edge. Sometimes when students file, they cup it, which means instead of having the file go straight across and stay straight, they file like this and it rounds the ends. You cannot cup the ends of your bezel. You need to make sure that you go straight. I'll do the same to the other end. Don't push hard in this step. Take it slow. You don't want to remove too much material. All right, once I've filed, and again, I'm just filing a tiny little bit off the end. I don't want to file too much. I'm going to come in with my 300 sandpaper. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different edges on this end that I have to sand. So there's top and bottom. There is the skinny edge, top, skinny edge, bottom, and then there's the very end, and I'm going to be really careful here not to cut when I sand. And what I'm doing right now is I'm sanding so that I can solder. So I'm cleaning all these surfaces so I can solder. You only need to clean the end of your bezel. Do not sand the whole thing, and you only need to get any dirt or grease that's on the surface off. So don't over sand and make a skinny little end. Remember, this is a light sanding just to get it clean for soldering. Now this one, if we look, is pretty crooked. So not only do I have to file it straight, or file off the pinch, I've got to file it straight, perpendicular to its long edge. In review, we're filing to straighten out that end, make sure there's no pinch to the metal there, and to make sure it is square to the length of the piece. Then we sand lightly to prep for soldering. Our next step is we need to get these two ends to touch solidly and then solder them. To do that, we're going to go through the process of making each of these bezel wires into a triangle. A lot of the times my students want to do this process and make it the shape of the stone. We're not quite there yet. You are going to grab your flat pliers. You'll hold your piece in the middle. On a smaller bezel wire like this, you're going to go right to the end, and you want to fold this up at a 90-degree angle to the wire. So if I turn it like this, it's at a 90. If I look at it like this is perpendicular to the length of the piece. I'll do the same on the other end. On a longer piece, on a longer bezel like this, I'm going to come back in a little further, but go through the same process. Fold it up at a 90. Then I'm going to grab my round pliers. I'm going to hold my wire in the middle, and I'm just going to use my 2 fingers here, and I'm going to push those 2 ends up towards the center. And then I want them to meet flat like a tabletop. So I'm going to take my flat pliers and I'm going to push them flat. And then I'm going to take some time to line them up here. You see how they meet flat like a tabletop in all directions, and they touch. Then I'm going to pass that seam back and forth over each other and try to tighten up that seam. I want these 2 ends of the bezel to push into each other and to have no cracks or breaks. This pops up a little in the center, so I'm going to flatten it a little bit more. All right, that's a good seam. There's no gaps in that seam. It's flat. When you look at it from the side, it looks like one continuous piece. Do the same for this one. Make sure those ends are flush and tight, ready to solder. Once your bezel is fit and flush and clean, you're going to take it to the soldering bench. Make sure you use a small flame, flux the outside of your seam first, then turn your bezel so you can reach the inside of the seam with your flux. Make sure that you're careful with that flame and keep some distance. You can see the outside has been fully fluxed. The inside as well, if my camera would focus on that for you, but you can see that it's white. On this piece, when it heated, the metal overlapped. So what I need to do before I finish fluxing that is I've got to pull this back apart so that those 2 edges where that overlap is occurring get fluxed. So I'm going to put my torch down, I'm going to use tweezers, pull these apart, put it back together, and then I'll finish fluxing this one. Make sure your seams align and then set up your bezels on a soldering block like this. Make sure you can see the inside of the seam flat on the block. If your bezel likes to fall over, put a block behind it to hold it up. Then you're going to put 1 small piece of hard solder on that seam like this. Here you can see the solder is set up like a little bridge right over that seam. You can see the same on this piece here. So you want to want 1/2 of the solder on one side of the seam, the other half on the other. This helps when it heats to make sure that that solder flows down the seam as opposed to staying on one side of the seam or the other. All right, at this point you're going to turn your torch on and have a low flame. Make sure it's small. You're going to heat your bezel back and forth slowly, trying to heat the whole thing evenly. This is going to go very quickly. As soon as that solder melts, pull the flame away, just like I did there. You saw how quickly I moved that flame. The bezel was starting to turn red and will melt rather quickly if you're not careful. Once the solder's flowed down the seam, you always want to pick it up and look at it. Pick this up and look. I can see the seam has filled on the front side and on the back side of the piece. There's no gaps in my seam, and so I'm going to set it into the pickle for my next step. I'll check the copper one too, because if it hasn't flown through the seam, what I can do is heat from the outside, and that heat pulls it through the seam to the outside of the piece, and we make sure that we've got a good, well soldered bezel, no gaps. I've rinsed and dried my bezels, and my next step now is to shape the bezels to fit the stone. I'm going to use a flat pliers for this. Put away those round ones. I'm also going to need sandpaper. Remember, flat pliers. You're going to want to use your round. Go to your corners or your high points and press very gently on each of the corners. Right now what you're trying to do is round it out. You're trying to create a round bezel and get rid of any major lumps and bumps. Here's a better angle. Squeeze really gently, take your time, go slow, and slowly work those corners out until you have a round shape. Then identify your seam. You want your seam to be on the flat edge of your stone. So I'm going to flatten out this edge a little bit here, and then I'll flatten out the opposite side, and I'll work on trying to make an oval using my flat pliers. I'll pinch down my corners and try to round them out slowly. Once I get a shape that's pretty close to what I'd like in the end, I'm going to put it over my stone and press down. And if you look, there's a little bit of a gap at the top of my stone. I'm not going to worry about it yet. I'll get my other stone ready in a similar way. Now it's time to get rid of those lumps. So now I'm going to go back with my flat pliers, not my round pliers, and I'm just going to very gently apply a little bit of pressure where there's high points or bumps. And I'm going to work on smoothing out my bezel. Whatever shape your bezel is the shape your stone will appear to be once your bezel is soldered down. So you want a nice, smooth, round bezel. You do not want any lumps. So take your time to make sure that's smooth and fits well. You don't want a big gap in any one place on your piece. You want it to be even around the whole stone. I'm going to do the same here with my larger piece, which is much lumpier because larger bezels get lumpier. It takes a little bit longer to make sure that fit is correct, but it's worth the time. Again, no lumpy bezels. Next step is cleaning the bezel for soldering. I'm going to put it on my sanding stick. I'm going to use my finger and I'm just going to rub it back and forth up and down the sanding stick. I want to clean the top and the bottom edges where it's going to touch the base of my piece. I also want to clean the outside edge of my bezel, but I don't want to sand away too much material and have a really skinny piece. So we're lightly sanding this piece, trying to get an overall clean shape. What's most important is the top and the bottom edge, not the inside or outside edges clean. So take your time. If you look carefully here, you'll see that there's patches where I haven't sanded all the way down to clean metal, and that's going to be okay. I went back in and I just double checked that the top and bottom of the bezel were fully clean, and in that process I probably made my bezel a little lumpy. I'm going to finalize the shape of my bezel using my tweezers, and I'm going to get really picky this time. No lumpy bezels, no lumpy bezels. So take your time, make this right. My larger bezel doesn't fit on my sanding stick, so instead I'm going to use a piece of sandpaper flat on the table and do the same process. Clean the top and bottom really nicely, then I'm going to use my sanding stick all the way around the edge. Make sure your bezel's clean so it solders nicely when it's time. And if you look here, you can see I've got a pretty lumpy bezel. And what have I said? That's right. No lumpy bezels. So I'm just going to go in, I'm going to use my fingers and my flat pliers and work until this piece is nice and smooth and even all the way around my stone. It's important to take time with this step. The shape of your bezel is what the shape of your stone appears to be. Make sure it's evenly spaced all the way around the stone before you go down to soldering. At this point, my bezel is ready to go. I've double checked the size of it. I've got clean metal for my backing piece, and I'm going to flux that back piece, and then I will flux my bezel. When I flux my bezel, I want to use a smaller flame. So if I'm starting off with a bigger flame for this back piece, I'm going to reduce the amount of gas and oxygen in that flame before I flux my bezel. Otherwise, I have a high likelihood of melting it. When you flex your bezel, make sure you turn down your flame so it's smaller, and make sure you get both the top and bottom edge well fluxed. All right, I've placed my bezel where I'd like it on my piece, and at this point I need to set up my solder. I make sure that my bezel has a really nice coating of flux on that bottom rim, and that all my metal is clean, as always when I'm soldering. I soldered my bezel to itself using hard flux, which melts at a much higher melting point, and I'm going to use easy flux. I used hard solder on my bezel to solder it to itself, and so I'm going to use easy solder to solder it down to my metal. Easy solder melts at a much lower melting point than the hard solder, so the hope is I'll get my bezel to solder down before the solder in the solder seam of the bezel melts. And anytime you're doing multiple solders, you start with hard solder for the first soldering. A second solder would be easy. If you're doing more than 2 solder runs, you would do hard, then medium, then easy. So each time you solder, you have a little bit less. On a small bezel, I usually put 4 pieces of solder if they're an average size, one at 12, 6, 3, and 9 if it were a clock. When you put that solder down, I usually drop it in and then I push it to the edge. It needs to touch the edge of the bezel and the bottom of the backer piece as well. When you're heating your piece to solder it down, you want to have a flame that's the right size for the backer piece, and you're going to try to avoid heating the bezel directly. You're going to heat up that back piece, which is much bigger and is going to take a lot more time to heat all the way. If you direct your heat to the bezel, that skinny little wire of metal is going to melt on you before it's ready to solder to the back. So heat your back piece first. Avoid the bezel when you're soldering bezels, unless of course you have a very small back piece, in which case that back piece will heat up at about the same rate that your bezel does. As my back piece reaches heat, which I can tell from color, I'm going to pull my flame down and around the bezel, and I'm going to heat until I see a little silver rim form all the way around the bezel, which it just did, so it's done. I'll bring you in close so you can see what to look for. All right, do you see that little silver rim all the way around? You want to make sure that there's no gaps in that silver before you walk away. So all the way on the inside you can see it, and all the way around the outside. That is a well soldered bezel. It happens pretty quick once you heat up that back piece. At this point you're going to put it in the flux, let it soak, and then you'll go through cleaning like you normally would on a soldered piece. I've pre-melted easy solder on the back of the branch here where it comes into the metal piece. I've set my bezel up, and I've also set up solder within that bezel, and if you look, I put quite a bit more solder inside this larger bezel than typical. I've got everything exactly where I need it. I'm using a little bit larger flame, but I'm making sure that I avoid my bezel. What I'm trying to do is heat up the silver piece in back and get my top branch to solder. I'm avoiding directly heating that bezel so I do not melt the bezel wire. Once that branch is soldered, my back piece of silver is heated up pretty well, and I just need to pull the solder around my bezel, and then I am done. It goes pretty quickly at that point. I am now ready for the last step, which is setting my stones. I have sanded, polished, oxidized, and made sure that I've got all the different parts of my piece ready to put together. And at this point, I'm going to put my stones into the bezel and push the bezel down. Make sure you do not put your stone into the bezel until it is time to push the bezel down, because it sometimes gets stuck and it's really hard to clean up when you've got a stone in there. While you are sanding and buffing, make sure that you don't buff or sand across the top of the bezel, because it can smush it down. It can also lower it. What you're going to do is pop your stone into your bezel, make sure it sits flat, and then you're going to take your bezel pusher and you are going to come in from the side, hovering above the back, and you're just going to push down or in and then rotate down. And you're going to work around your bezel and just do a little bit at a time. I start at noon, and then I do 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and then I'm going to come in from my corners and start pushing those down, and I'm just going to keep rotating around my stone. Every time I go around, when there's a high point, I come in and I push that high point down. One thing that's important to note is when I'm coming in and I'm pushing with my bezel pusher, is that I'm hovering above the bottom of the piece. So I'm pushing here and then I rotate. So I push here and I rotate up and in. Do not rest the bezel pusher on your base. If you rest the bezel pusher on your base, you are going to dent your base. You're going to scratch it, and then it's a pain to clean it up. So make sure that bezel pusher is resting above. And again, you're just going to keep going around and slowly pushing in, rotate up, round and round and round until that bezel is nice and flush to the stone all the way around. Try to take it one little bit at a time, and careful not to do that. You push too hard, it'll go across the top of your stone sometimes, and that can scratch your stone. This is usually where I have, like, students want to stop. They say, oh, the stone's not coming out. But if you look really carefully, you can see that there's still gaps around my stone and my stone's still moving. So I need to keep pushing, pushing, pushing until that's flush with the stone. Slow and steady wins the race on this one. And now my stone isn't moving. There's no gaps between the bezel and the stone. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this and I'm going to kind of roll my bezel pusher along that bezel, just smoothing out the bezel all the way around. And again, I'm not resting it on the back of my metal piece. I'm keeping it all on this top edge of the bezel. You should have a nice smooth bezel all the way around your stone. There shouldn't be any movement to it, and you shouldn't have any gaps. When that's what you have in front of you, you know you're done. Another really important thing to note when you're pushing your bezel down is you want to push it down a little bit at a time and work evenly all the way around the stone. You don't want to push one section all the way down to the stone before the other sections are close. That'll create kinks in your bezel that are really difficult to get out. So you're going to push the whole thing in, working round and round and round, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, until the whole thing is flush. And then don't forget to go around and roll the edge of your bezel and burnish it so you have a nice smooth finish. All right, at this point I have 2 set stones. If I've scratched my back piece a little bit, I need to go back to the buff. Try avoid buffing your stone. Focus just on the back of the piece. Really try to avoid getting that buffing compound in the stone. It can sometimes stain certain stones that are more porous. You're also not going to want to put a piece with a stone into a sonic cleaner. Again, that can discolor certain stones. Once I've got that finished up, then it is time to assemble my pieces. That is the last step, my friends.